The American people have watched with deep sorrow how your nationalist revolution was betrayed.
You, the reporters, are wonderful. You, the writers, are wonderful.
We are against all kinds of dictators.
Combatientes cubanos.
A tyrannical dictatorship.
The only place in the hemisphere where human rights are trampled upon.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right.
I'm appealing to the young people of Cuba who will lift something up, build something new.
A critical focus of our increased engagement will continue to be improving the Cuban government's respect for human rights and advocating for democratic reforms within Cuba.
I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas.
From Air Force One to the American classics that still cruise the streets of Havana, we'll take you through a turning point in history. Our team spent a week in Havana with President Obama, St. Petersburg Mayor Rick Kreisman, and baseball legends who built new bridges with the people of Cuba.
One thing they agree on for sure is how much they love the game.
America is changing its strategy to try to transform Cuba. We'll show you video and snapshots of this island nation from a perspective that Americans rarely see. We'll explain why Cuba needs help, what's in it for us, how it relates to Tampa Bay, why our politicians disagree, and where we go from here.
So the motorcade just went through and...
Plus, Scott Smith and Merissa Lynn share their insight on a defining moment in sports and what it means for Major League Baseball and the Tampa Bay Rays. This is Money, Power, and Politics on assignment in Cuba.
Hello, I'm Craig Patrick, and this week we're in an island nation that has been sealed off and off limits to Americans for more than 50 years. This is the skyline of Havana, Cuba, and the thawing relations that are playing out between our nations as we speak can drive some big changes in Florida and very specifically in Tampa Bay. But to see where we're going, we have to step back and look at where we've been.
Along the skyline of Havana, you still see the remnants of the Iron Fist of Spain. The Spanish conquerors built this fortress to protect what they had seized. Cuba's military governor, Hernando de Soto, then sailed on to Tampa Bay, landing at what we now call De Soto National Park. But while Spain eventually let go of Florida, it bared down on Cuba until the independence movement took off once again from Tampa. Cuban guerrillas rose up against their conquerors, and when a U.S. warship called the Maine sank in Havana, maybe due to a boiler explosion, American journalists blamed it on Spain. And so the U.S. declared war. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders sailed yet again from Tampa to Cuba, and so Cuba slipped from the grip of Spain to the grip of the United States. It became a U.S. protectorate, and we took over, or leased, Guantanamo Bay as a permanent naval base. Havana became a playground for American tourists. Then in 1952, a corrupt dictator named Batista seized power. He struck deals with the American mafia and profited from casinos and brothels and organized crime while the people suffered. So Fidel Castro came along. He led a rebellion from the Sierra Maestra Mountains. People fed up with Batista's corruption and abuse joined his fight and swept Castro into power in 1959. America was hopeful about Castro at the time. You may not believe what he said at the National Press Club in Washington.
We are against all kinds of dictators. We are not agree with communism.
But after he spoke out against dictators and communists, Castro became a communist dictator. He seized billions in American assets and jailed and murdered his critics. Soviet Premier Khrushchev declared Castro a hero of the Soviet Union. America severed ties and imposed a trade embargo. Then, in 1962, a U-2 spy plane revealed Soviet missile bases going up that could annihilate the United States. President Kennedy ordered a blockade.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
It took us to the brink of a nuclear World War III, but Khrushchev blinked and turned back his ships with their missiles on deck. From there, Cuba relied on the Soviets for help. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba suffered. American leaders continued to squeeze Cuba in hopes that it would drive the Castro regime from power. Until December of 2014, when President Obama changed more than 50 years of foreign policy in one fell swoop.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
He relaxed travel and banking restrictions, and then the president traveled to Havana and stunned the people of Cuba.
The rule of law should not include arbitrary detentions of people who exercise those rights. And yes, I believe voters should be able to choose their governments in free and democratic elections.
He called on young Cubans to rise up and drive change on state-run TV right in front of their dictator.
I believe citizens should be free to speak their mind without fear, to organize, and to criticize their government.
Cubans told us they could not believe it, and then we started hearing some whispers about corruption. For example, Cuba has a dual currency system in which the money tourists exchange is worth much more than the Cuban peso. And some told us off camera that corrupt officials are constantly taking cuts or demanding kickbacks of whatever money comes in. In other words, they compared the Castro regime to the American mafia. But some told us it's also important to have Americans here because it gives Cubans insight and perspective that could drive the real change they need.
And so now Americans can travel to Cuba, and when they get here, they take a step back in time. You watch the surf pound the streets of Havana. You see the salt water splash across the cars, and yet you don't see much rust or any rust, which is different because we made those cars around 60 years ago. They've gone through 6 decades of wear and saltwater showers, and many still look pristine.
The culture of Havana is just so rich. The people are, so full of pride.
At first glance along the streets, you see the fruit stands and dogs lounging around the curb or stretching out in the streets. But when you look in the doors and windows, you notice the people, many of them busy at work, toiling away. It appears to be a lot of redevelopment, fueled in part by new American tourist money. We asked this man what he's doing in this dark room. He laughed and said he's fixing the lights.
This is a country with a lot of challenges. You look at their infrastructure and they are doing their best.
To put that another way, the buildings are not holding up nearly as well as a lot of the cars. And when you go beyond the tourist zone, you find a lot of blight.
Well, Havana is going through a renaissance and it's preparing for more tourism and business from the United States. But there's a catch. Coming up, the push to lift the trade embargo and what that could mean for Tampa Bay. As you walk down the streets, you can't help but notice the classic American cars like this old Chevy. They're all still putting down the streets, and a city that was sealed off to Americans for more than 50 years is now bustling with American tourists. Bands play on the street corners of old Havana, and while a couple of people told us to back off with our camera, many, in fact most we found, welcomed us and our money.
A man just came up and just started talking to us. He showed us around. He showed us all of his friends' places. It was, I don't know, he just made us feel like we were part of the people who live there.
Jordan Kreisman is 18 and on her first trip to Cuba. Her father, St. Pete Mayor Rick Kreisman, brought his whole family along to witness a turning point in history.
We're also seeing very friendly people who are very warm and open to Americans.
And several who noticed the mayor's Rays shirt walked up to him to talk about the big game between Tampa Bay and Cuba.
I think Major League Baseball was very wise in their decision in choosing this franchise, this team, because of who they are as players and who ownership is.
They're also keyed into President Obama's visit and hope that it will drive more changes yet to come. Well, Cubans tell us this is the oldest restaurant and bar in Havana. It's been around for nearly 200 years, and they named it after Florida. This was one of American writer Ernest Hemingway's favorite spots, and once again, it's packed with American tourists.
I think it's very good for us.
Humberto Domnash knows English, and he knows something about the history of Tampa from his days in school, because Cuba's national hero, Jose Marti, rallied for Cuba's independence from Spain in the late 1800s from Tampa.
Our national hero, Jose Marti, stayed in Tampa a long time ago, in this moment, I'll tell you, Tampa is a very good city and very good part in the United States.
So, like most Cubans, he thinks of Tampa as the cradle of Cuba's liberation movement.
It's a very important part in our history, and he was a big writing too, writing for the children, writing for the people. It's very important for us too. I love Jose Marti.
And while Marti transformed Cuba, Cubans transformed Tampa by settling into Ybor City and running Tampa's cigar factories.
The connection between Tampa Bay and Cuba is direct, and it's long, and it's based on families as well as tradition. And I think, at the end of the day, Craig, that's what, this week, that's what this experience is all about. It's about people. It's not about governments.
And like its history, Cuba's future may now lead right through Tampa Bay. And now the Cuban government has to decide where to open its first consulate in the United States in 55 years, and St. Petersburg's mayor wants to bring it home. Coming up, we'll follow St. Pete Mayor Rick Kreisman through Cuba and show you how he's trying to strike a very big deal. A few days after Secretary of State John Kerry opened the U.S. Embassy in Havana, St. Petersburg Mayor Rick Kreisman came here on a mission. He's promoting the idea of a Cuban consulate in St. Petersburg, and he returned 6 months later with some unfinished business. And as we explored Havana's inner city, we also discovered other explorers from Tampa Bay who have been here before.
There's a richness of culture that's unparalleled, really.
Kevin King is Chief of Staff to St. Petersburg Mayor Rick Kreisman. The mayor brought his leadership team on a second trip to Cuba on a mission. They're here this week first and foremost to support the Tampa Bay Rays, but they're also trying to convince the Cuban government to open a consulate in St. Pete.
To me, having a consulate office in St. Petersburg is a natural fit for who we are as a community, and it's just that next step.
Kreisman and his team have already discussed this with high-level Cuban officials, and given Cuba's deep and long-running ties to Tampa Bay, they say it could pay off for both sides.
We're just creating this international sort of flavor to St. Pete, so this really gels with what we're trying to accomplish.
It's a great chance to make connections. We're working very hard to bring the consulate there, working hard to connect with the people of Havana and erase boundaries and build bridges.
Of course, there are many Cuban exiles who do not want to build bridges with the Castro regime given its history. City leaders in Miami and critics of the Cuban thaw in general say Kreisman is making a mistake, but he says that criticism may work to his advantage in landing the first consulate.
Miami doesn't want it. The mayor has been very outspoken in stating that they don't want the consulate office there. We want it. We would welcome it.
It's just a wonderful way for St. Pete to further connect with the world. We're geographically located in a way that really makes us a doorway to much of Latin America.
And while Mayor Kreisman focuses on landing a Cuban consulate, President Obama is pressing Congress to lift the trade embargo against Cuba. The United States ships a lot of food into Cuba, but Cuba cannot ship its food or products into the United States because Cuban imports are banned under the embargo, and growing waves of tourists want that to change.
They're a very poor country, and they've become a very poor country because of the embargo.
But Republican political strategist Adam Goodman sees it from a different point of view. He came here with a student study group.
As a Republican, we feel this is a reaction to the tyranny that's been foisted on the people of Cuba for all these years, but it's not working.
And that's driving the push from the Cuban capital to lift the embargo, and a growing debate in our country over what comes next.
It's a difficult thing for many Republicans in particular to just willy-nilly lift the embargo when so many questions are left unanswered. I still think a lot of details have to be worked out. My opinion is we're on the road to lifting the embargo, but I don't think we're ready to do it tonight.
Florida businessmen like Robert Fox are more than ready. He owns a trucking company and wants to cash in.
Millions and millions of dollars. I would expect to be able to expand by 20 or 30% my operation because of what we do, logistics, trucking, U.S. Customs bonded warehousing.
Like many other Americans you see on these streets, he's learning and preparing for the chance to tap into this new market of more than 11 million people.
The people here are fantastic. I think everyone is just looking for an opportunity.
The people of Cuba really, they're struggling. They have little enough, and there's opportunity for our country here too. So why not help both sides?
Well, again, critics say it will not help the people of Cuba. They want Cuba to open the door to freedom before we open the door to trade. Well, as politicians in Washington debate their next steps, Major League Baseball is already making a move. Coming up, see how the Cuban thaw can transform America's pastime. Scott Smith and Merissa Lynn show us what it means for Florida and the Tampa Bay Rays when we come back. Well, you see some striking contrast here in Havana. For example, take a look at the Capitol building. It is very large, in good shape, and yet going through repairs and renovations. And just on each side of it, you see other buildings that still need a whole lot of work. While parts of Havana are thriving, many others are struggling. Americans want to help, but are divided on how to do it. And we found the Cuban people are divided as well.
I think Obama is the good president.
Noel Ponce Gonzalez flagged us down to tell us he has family in Florida, and he wanted us to know he likes President Obama and really wants Hillary Clinton to succeed him.
Last years, in my dreams, I looked at Hillary, president, in my dreams.
From what he's heard on state-run media, he thinks she will continue the course to thawing relations with Cuba.
Hillary, hello. You are the next president of the United States. My love for you and your husband, the Bill Clinton.
But while one of our taxi drivers said many Cubans see President Obama as a hero, others do not. Another driver, an older man, told us he doesn't like all the Americans here and charged us extra for the traffic and hassle. And so as we try to work through our differences, our governments brought us together through baseball.
I got my whole family from a place called La Panchita, little country place, central north part of the island.
Las Diaz is an umpire who hopes the Rays game with Cuba will open the door to more games, and with that, more talks and more common ground.
Definitely hope so, because I've spoken to some of them, and they would love to play in the States and come back to their homeland and live.
Okay, we're now poolside at the Milla Cajiba Hotel, and I'm here with our sports team who also spent this week in Cuba with us, Merissa Lynn and Scott Smith. Let's start with the big game and where we go from here. What are the next steps for Major League Baseball, for the Rays, and for Cuba?
I think the ideal thing would be to try to have a game like this played on a more consistent basis. I'm not really optimistic about it. I'm hopeful that it could happen. I think that would be a wonderful thing. After being here and seeing how much it's embraced by the Cuban people and how much of a kick the Rays players got out of the whole experience, I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's great for the game of baseball. But as you know, I think because of the overarching political kind of factors at play, I think that's a tough sell. This experience has been fantastic, and being able to be here and watch the game in that stadium and see how those fans reacted it's an experience that I'm gonna take with me forever. It was fantastic.
First, I heard some folks in Cuba saying they wish that players could move from Cuba to America and be able to return home, play baseball without having to defect. Do you think that could be a next step somewhere down the line, or maybe even a Major League Baseball team in Cuba?
The Cuban national team, you saw how well received they were by the people here. You would think that they would want those players to have those kinds of opportunities in the future. I just don't think that this is something that's going to be happening tomorrow or next year or maybe even the next few years. So you would hope so, but you just don't know.
On a personal level, what struck you the most when you were here in Cuba?
Just how well received we were as the media, people from the United States. We had one experience where I was shooting the Rays getting into the bus on the morning of the big game, and the bus drivers wanted to get a photo with me, and I'm like, wait, you don't know who I am? They're like, no, we really want a photo. And the other thing that really struck me was the one night we all went to dinner here, and we noticed that they had an American flag on their lapel, and it had been from the Secret Service. They had eaten there on a previous night, and they had given them this token of their appreciation, and they wore it proudly. And you just have to think that how much they appreciated us in bringing this kind of good publicity to this country.
When I was at the game and all the festivities started happening, it kind of gave me goosebumps. There was a moment when they played the national anthem, our national anthem, and it was sung by a choir, a Cuban choir, and it was sung beautifully. And I was just thinking, the Star Spangled Banner is being sung on Cuban soil. How many people would have never saw this day coming, decades ago? So I just think that, those are things that are going to stick with me forever. I think the people were fantastic, and just exploring, being out and about in the city, and seeing obviously their love for baseball too. When they were packed around the stadium just trying to get in, they care a lot about the sport.
And there is one other member of our team who is not here with the three of us because he's shooting the three of us. That's Joe Vasquez. And here's a couple of pictures of Joe. Here he's looking rather serious as we're driving through the streets of Havana. And here he is looking not so serious. So he had a little bit of fun while he was here. But I want to thank Joe for all of his time. I want to thank all of you for watching this special presentation of Money, Power, and Politics. And of course, we will see you next week. Thank you.